They thought it was a sheep at first. Just another bloated shape tangled in the wet roots of the Meath boglands. But when Porrick O'Shea's spade struck soft flesh under the sodden moss, and not wool, his heart dropped into the silence. It was a human hand, pale, preserved, fingernails still clean. But the strangest part? The corpse wore a black North Face jacket. That brand hadn't even existed 2,000 years ago. I thought I was hallucinating, Porrick told the Garda. I scraped down to the wrist, and I swear, there was still warmth in the skin. But when the forensic team dated the body using radiocarbon testing, the results shattered logic. Death occurred approximately 2,038 years ago, and yet, his boots were waterproof Gore-Tex. His watch, still ticking, had a 2024 manufacturer's serial. He had a USB stick in his pocket. The bog has always taken, but it had never given back anything like this. Locals in Trim, County Meath, started whispering, "The bog's walking time again." But for Porrick, the nightmares began immediately. In them, the man's face floated just beneath the peat, eyes open, mouth gently moving as if still speaking, as if reciting something. "He was trying to tell me something," Porrick later said. "I just couldn't hear over the crows." The Garda identified the body using the fingerprints, pristine and undamaged, despite the dating. He was Dr. Ronan Fenn, a 38-year-old historian and folklorist from Dublin who had vanished 6 months prior while researching druidic sacrificial sites. His last known location? A guest cottage near Loughcrew Cairns, a site known for solstice alignments and whispered curses. He had been alone. No phone calls since. No trace. Inside his jacket pocket, police found a journal soaked in bog water. Much of it was illegible, but one phrase, scribbled repeatedly on the back page, still stood out, written with frantic pressure that tore through the parchment. "They walk time when the veil breaks. They don't forget. They don't forgive." By the end of the week, Porrick stopped sleeping altogether. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. Not just the man. Others. Watching him from the bog edge. Some wore robes. Some were shadows. All of them stood perfectly still, until one raised a hand, pointing directly at him. He was convinced now he'd unearthed something that should have stayed buried. But the strangest development came when Garda reviewed Ronan Fenn's laptop, recovered from a moss-covered satchel just 10 feet from the body. The last file saved? A PDF titled, "The Curse of Kronos, Druidic Time-Walking Rituals." Inside were pages of references to ancient Irish rites designed to collapse time during seasonal thresholds, Beltan, Samhain, the solstice, and offer living tribute across eras. Ronan's last typed words, right before disappearing: "If this works, I'll see them. I'll see the old gods. But I may not come back the same." What could Ronan possibly have meant? Was it a metaphor for obsession? Or a literal warning? And why did the forensic team find tiny bone fragments, not human, pressed into the lining of his boot soles? Porrick didn't care to find out. The bog had bled once. He feared it might not stop now. You can't unsee the bog once it takes hold of your mind. Porrick hadn't stepped foot near the bogland since the discovery. But in his head, when he tried to sleep, when he closed his eyes, when he blinked too long, he could feel it. The damp air pressing against his lungs. The slow, sucking earth beneath his boots. The smell of old iron and something sweeter, rotting beneath it. But that night, it wasn't in his mind anymore. He woke at 3:03 a.m. to the smell of peat smoke, inside his house. "I thought maybe I'd left the stove burning," Porrick later said. But the house was freezing. Not a single ember lit. And there, in the center of his hallway, lay a trail of wet footprints. Bare feet, mud-caked, leading from his front door straight to his bedroom. Who had been inside? How did they vanish without a sound? And why didn't the dog bark? He reported it to the local Garda station. But they laughed it off. "It's the damp playing tricks," one said. "Bog gas and nerves." But Porrick wasn't laughing. Especially not after what he found nailed to his back door the next morning. A strip of paper, bog damp, folded 3 times, held in place with a rusted iron nail. Scrawled in ancient-looking letters, "The door is open. You invited the breath. Meanwhile, in Dublin, Dr. Maeve Lorcan, Ronan Fenn's former colleague, had just been informed of his confirmed death. But when she visited the coroner's office to retrieve his belongings, the moment she saw his face through the glass, she gasped. That's not Ronan," she whispered. "At least, not the Ronan I knew." She described the body as bloated, yet too pristine. The skin didn't sag like it should. The eyes were wrong. They looked like they were still seeing something. Worse still, she insisted Ronan had no tattoos, but carved into the skin above the corpse's sternum, so faint it looked almost healed, was a circular glyph, a symbol she recognized. She'd seen it once before in Ronan's notes, drawn next to a passage about rites that preserve the vessel for transference. He said he found it on the wall of a tomb, said it was etched from the inside. The Garda, now reluctantly intrigued, released the contents of Ronan's waterproof satchel to Maeve for academic review. Among the books and field notes was a folded map, hand-drawn, covered in smudges of red earth and something darker. At its center was a crude symbol of concentric circles, and 3 words, "Na fail sensuari," do not wake the ancients. Maeve had one reaction. Oh God, he found it. She didn't wait for the university board. She packed her bags, grabbed her own old notebooks, and took the next train to County Meath. But what she didn't know, what no one had yet connected, was that 3 other peat cutters from neighboring counties had also vanished in the last 2 weeks. And in each case, the only thing left behind was a shallow footprint in the earth and a faint burn mark in the shape of a circle. No struggle, no blood, just silence, like something had reclaimed them. Meanwhile, Porrick began hearing sounds beneath the floorboards. Low humming, breathy whispers that made no sense, yet his bones seemed to understand them. One phrase returned night after night, rising from the bog and echoing in his dreams. He woke them. You must close the door. But what door? And if Ronan woke something, did that mean it had been waiting? Watching. I think I was marked when I dug him up, Porrick confessed. Whatever followed me home, it wasn't alone. And in the last image from Ronan's laptop, captured by his GoPro the day he vanished, he stands in front of a sunken stone circle, smiling. Behind him, just visible through the trees, a shadow, tall, still, and wearing his face. Maeve should have turned back the moment the train passed Athboy. She could feel it then. A pressure, not in her ears, but in her bones. Like the land was pushing inward. Like the trees leaned just a little too far toward the tracks. Like something old and sentient was waiting beneath the soil, watching her return. It felt like I was trespassing, she would later say. Like the air around County Meath had memory. And it remembered me. She hadn't been here in years. Not since she and Ronan had last combed the Loughcrew cairns together during their thesis research, chasing legends of the ancient breathers, a pre-Celtic sect said to vanish and reappear across centuries. A group Ronan believed didn't die in the bogs. They simply waited. Back then, it was myth. Now Ronan was dead. And Maeve had questions. She arrived at the guest cottage where he'd last been seen. It stood slanted against the wind, moss growing in the corners, a broken gutter whispering in the breeze. But inside, something was wrong. There were no mirrors. Not a single one. Not above the sink. Not on the wardrobe. Not even a shard of glass. All missing, ripped clean from the walls, jagged holes left behind. On the kitchen table lay an untouched dinner plate. Burnt stew now hardened. And beside it, a handwritten letter in Ronan's unmistakable scrawl. They mimic first through reflections. Do not trust your own voice. It will lie to you. Burn this house when you leave. Maeve stepped back, her heart pounding like a trapped animal in her chest. But something else caught her eye. On the wooden floor, etched faintly as if carved by a child's hand, was a single circular symbol. The same glyph from Ronan's chest. It glowed faintly under her flashlight, like it had been recently exposed. And when she stepped closer, her phone buzzed violently. No service. The screen blinked twice, then displayed an image she hadn't taken. A photo of her, standing in the doorway. But in the image, her eyes were wrong solid black. And behind her, where no one had been standing, was the shadowed outline of a man wearing Ronan's coat. "The second face," she whispered aloud, voice shaking. "It's not him. It's wearing him." Back in Trim, Porrick had begun losing time. He would blink and find hours had passed. Once, he awoke covered in wet mud, kneeling outside his barn with no memory of walking there. "I think I've been sleepwalking," he confessed to the local priest. "But sometimes I speak in a language I don't know." Father Declan grew pale. "Ancient tongues. They say some were only spoken by the dead." Meanwhile, the forensics team ran a second scan on Ronan's remains, under pressure from Maeve's academic claims that the corpse may not be entirely human. They discovered 2 extra vertebrae, fused with calcium not native to modern human anatomy. His teeth showed no signs of wear, and the brain, though removed for study, had been coated in a thin film of bog pollen dated 10,000 years old. Maeve tried to leave the cottage the next morning, but her car wouldn't start. The engine was bone dry, not just of fuel, but of oil, coolant, transmission fluid, completely hollowed out, like it had been drained. There were no signs of tampering, just a single red string tied to the antenna. She walked back to the porch and found a new note nailed to the door with an iron nail, trembling in the wind. "If you stay 3 nights, you belong to them." Night fell again, and inside the cottage, Maeve began to read Ronan's journal in full. The last entry chilled her beyond language. "I saw myself this morning. I smiled, but I wasn't smiling. My eyes stayed still while my face moved. I am starting to forget how my voice used to sound. Tonight is the solstice. If I cross the ring, I think I'll become what waits. But what if I already did?" Maeve dropped the book, her hands shaking uncontrollably. And then, a knock. Soft. 3 slow knocks on the window beside her. She turned toward the glass. But no one was there. Just her own reflection staring back. Except her reflection didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just watched her and smiled. Maeve didn't sleep that night. Not really. Not even with the curtains closed and every door bolted shut. Because every time she blinked, she feared she'd see her reflection again. Not where it should be, but behind her, watching, smiling, breathing when she didn't. And at 3:03 a.m., the exact time Porrick first reported the scent of peat in his home, the window whispered. Not the wind, not the house creaking, the glass itself. A thin, wet breath dragged slowly across it, followed by something far worse, a single, clear handprint. From the inside, she backed away slowly, grabbing Ronan's journal like a lifeline. The entries had grown frantic in the last pages. Sentences bled together. Diagrams spilled across margins. His handwriting, once sharp and confident, slanted and broke like the hand had twitched as it wrote. But one passage stuck out. "They don't speak in words. They press into your thoughts like water through cracked stone. You won't hear them, but you'll feel what they want." Maeve stumbled into the back bedroom, journal clutched tightly, and finally noticed the pattern. The house was warmer every night, the air thicker, the silence heavier. It was like something was growing not outside, but inside the walls, inside her. By morning, a headache bloomed behind her eyes like fire, and when she glanced into her phone's front camera to check her reflection, she froze. Her lips were moving, but she hadn't said anything. And behind her, just over her shoulder in the reflection, was Ronan, smiling that same too-wide smile, the one with no soul behind it. Terrified, Maeve ran to town, back to Trim, to the local archives, desperate for real answers. She pored over the folklore texts she and Ronan once mocked for being too superstitious. That's when she found it. The Chronovale Breathers, an obscure sect noted in a 1743 translation of a now-lost Celtic codex, known only through whispered testimony. They were not druids, not priests, but conduits, vessels for what came before time. They did not die. They did not age. They returned when summoned and when fed. Ronan had been trying to contact them. That much was clear. But what Maeve hadn't realized until now was that he'd succeeded. And when she returned to the guest house, the evidence was undeniable. The front door was wide open, though she'd locked it with her own hands, and the smell of peat was thick enough to sting her throat. On the floor, a circle of salt had been swept away, Ronan's last protection. She turned slowly, every muscle in her body tensed like piano wire, and that's when she heard it, a voice, but not a voice. It came from inside her own mind, whispered not in words, but memories. Do you remember the red string? Do you remember the scream that never came? We watched you even then. Maeve collapsed against the wall, heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might break. The journal spilled open beside her. Inside, scribbled in the margins in ink she hadn't seen before. Night 2. They are hungry. They remember her. The girl who walked the cairns. The one who looked through the crack. A crack? Maeve's breath caught. She had looked. Years ago, during her first visit with Ronan to the Loughcrew cairns. He dared her to peer into the thin crevice between the stones during sunset, when the light hit just right. She remembered cold air, and a noise that sounded like bones turning slowly. She laughed it off back then. But maybe they didn't. Suddenly, she remembered something else. A small, red notebook Ronan used to keep separate from the journal. He called it his ghost pages. She tore through the cottage, checking drawers, lifting floorboards, and finally found it, tucked behind the headboard. Moldy, warped, but intact. Inside were crude drawings of faces, twisted, smiling, blurred like he'd drawn them while crying. One page had just 4 words, scratched so deep the paper tore. Don't let her in. Beneath it, a rough sketch of a woman's silhouette, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, her feet not touching the ground. And under the sketch, a new note, one not in Ronan's handwriting. This one was smoother, deliberate. She already has. Maeve dropped the notebook, and behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned slowly, every nerve on fire. But the room was empty, except the mirror she'd brought in her luggage, still zipped and sealed in a bag in the hallway closet, was now sitting upright on the table. And in the reflection, Maeve was smiling, but her eyes weren't blinking. There was no denying it anymore. Something had crossed through. Something old. Something that didn't belong in the world of clocks and logic and light. And now it was wearing her face. Maeve didn't remember setting the mirror down on the table. She didn't remember unzipping her bag. She didn't remember even touching the mirror since she packed it in Dublin. But there it was, framed in black, sitting perfectly upright, and there she was, blinking out of rhythm, smiling with teeth that looked just slightly too many, tilting her head in a way no human neck should. "This isn't me," Maeve whispered aloud, but the reflection moved its lips just a beat too late, like a dubbed film, mouthing the same words. "This isn't me." Then it smiled, wider, and then it stopped mimicking altogether. The smile faded. Its mouth began to open, slowly, wider than Maeve's could, and from it came a sound that wasn't a voice but a memory, a scream, her mother's voice, in the hospital, the day her father flatlined, a whisper, her own voice years ago, daring Ronan. "You first. If there's anything behind that cairn, I'll kiss it." A soundless gasp, the moment she'd looked into the stone crack and saw something crawl away in the dark. Maeve screamed and threw the mirror to the floor. It shattered. But the sound that came from the glass wasn't glass at all. It was wet breathing, and something that whispered, "You looked. You were marked. You're not her anymore." Desperate for answers, Maeve fled to the last place Ronan had ever documented, the circle of standing stones near Loughcrew. It wasn't on any tourist map. It wasn't marked on modern GPS. But Ronan had drawn a crude route in his journal, through the woods, past the elder tree split in two, down the ravine where the air turned cold even in summer. She followed the path exactly, and when she emerged through the trees, she found the stones. 6 black monoliths, slick with moss. One had fallen, cracked down the center, almost like it had been split from within. And at the center of the circle, a sinkhole, perfectly round. No debris, no leaves inside. Just a slow, rising breath of warm, damp air. Maeve felt her knees weaken. because carved into the nearest stone, faint but unmistakable, was the same circular glyph from Ronan's chest, from the floorboards, from the journal. And below it, in newer cuts, her own name, Maeve Lorcan, looked through the veil. Night 2. Marked. She turned to run, but a voice inside her bones froze her in place. Not spoken aloud, not even thought, just delivered. Stay. Let us show you the truth. Remember what you forgot. Suddenly, flashback, the crack in the stone at Loughcrew. Maeve 19, holding Ronan's hand, laughing nervously. It's just shadows, he said. But Maeve had seen it. A girl, pale, hair matted with peat, standing just behind the crack, mimicking her movements, turning her head when Maeve did, lifting a hand to match hers. Maeve looked away, laughed it off. But what if she had left something behind when she looked? Or worse, what if something came through her? Back at the stone circle, Maeve knelt beside the glyph and touched it gently. Her fingers began to bleed, not from a cut, but from pores opening too wide, like her body had forgotten its own shape. The glyph pulsed, and the air sang, not with music but with memories. The drowned, the buried, the time walkers, and then one more image. Ronan, standing at this very spot, tears running down his face. I thought I could learn from them, he sobbed in the vision. But they didn't want a student. They wanted a body. Suddenly, Maeve was back, gasping for breath on her knees, bleeding from the nose and fingertips. Something had shown her the memory. Not hers, Ronan's. And now she knew. The peat doesn't just preserve bodies. Preserves time, pocket, a loop, and Ronan had been the offering. But what Maeve feared most, she might be the replacement. She stumbled backward from the stones, and standing at the treeline was herself. Same coat, same hair, same expression, except that version wasn't breathing, and it whispered with her voice. Let me come back now. You've been here too long. Maeve didn't run, because when you see yourself standing across from you, motionless, breathless, and still somehow smiling, there's no instinct left to run. Only one thought. How long has she been watching me? The doppelgänger didn't move. Not at first. It stood at the treeline, arms at its sides, head tilted with a soft curiosity, like someone watching a childhood video they didn't remember filming. But then, slowly, its mouth began to open, not to speak, to echo. Maeve heard it first in her bones. A low vibration, like a chant made of heartbeat and memory. Then came the words, soft, fractured, and spoken in her voice, but cracked like a wet record spinning too slow. You left me in the stone. You took the breath. Now give it back. Time owes its hunger. Maeve stumbled backward into the stone circle. She could feel the air compress around her like a vacuum seal. The monoliths began to hum, not with sound, but with gravity, pulling her toward the sinkhole in the center. She dug her heels into the moss, breath hitching. I didn't leave anyone. I don't know what you are. But the thing didn't flinch. It simply took one step forward. And with that step, the ground behind Maeve rippled. Not broke, not cracked, rippled. As if the earth itself was no longer solid, but a surface of time stretched too thin. Then it spoke again, this time not in echo, but in command. The bog does not return what it keeps. You were supposed to drown in the moment you forgot. Maeve's knees buckled. She remembered now. She had blacked out once at the cairns years ago. Just for a few seconds. Just a dizzy spell, Ronan had said. But something entered in that space. She didn't pass out. She was replaced. Not entirely. Not yet. But a seed was planted in her breath, in her marrow. And now the soil, the bog, it was calling it forth. Desperate, Maeve pulled Ronan's red ghost notebook from her coat pocket. She had kept it close since the cottage. Her only tether to what was real. In the margins were more strange glyphs. Ones she hadn't seen before. But the last page was blank. Until now, as she opened it, words began to appear, bleeding through the paper as if written from beneath. Burn the name that opened the breath. Break the loop or be taken. Maeve looked at her name, carved into the stone behind her. The glyph beside it. The sinkhole breathing like a sleeping beast. And the thing that looked like her, now just 10 feet away. She made her choice. She pulled a penknife from her boot, a gift from her father years ago, and carved a line through her name on the stone. Then another. And then, she cut her palm, blood mixing with the damp moss, and pressed her hand to the glyph. The reaction was instant. The stone glowed white-hot, steam rising as if her blood had ignited it. The air split not with sound but with a memory roar. Suddenly, she was everywhere she had ever been. The hospital room with her dying father. The first time she kissed Ronan under that oak. The crack in the stone where she first saw the girl. The lecture hall where she laughed at curses. All layered over one another, folding time into a scream made of moments. And at the center of it all, the other Maeve, still smiling, now crying, now burning. You were me, Maeve whispered. But I never agreed to stay broken. She grabbed the red notebook and tore out the last page, setting it ablaze with the lighter from Ronan's field pack. The flame hissed, not like fire, but like air being sucked back into something hollow. And the moment the page turned to ash, the doppelgänger shrieked, not with her voice, but with all of them. Hundreds, thousands, a collective scream of souls that had worn her face and lost it. And then it collapsed into itself, folding like wet cloth, dragged backward into the sinkhole as the stones cracked and breathed out one final time. Maeve fell to her knees. The world around her was silent. The sky above was pale, the bog quiet, and inside her head, a single sentence remained. You closed the breath, but you are not untouched. She didn't speak on the walk back to Trim. The townsfolk who saw her said she looked older, paler, like someone who had returned from a place no one should go. And when she tried to tell the Garda what happened, they found the circle had vanished. No stones, no sinkhole, just flat ground and a single mirror shard buried in the moss. She kept it. That night, Maeve sat alone in her Dublin flat. She placed the mirror shard on the table. She stared at her reflection, and for the first time in days, her reflection blinked at the same time. It smiled when she did. It moved only when she moved. But as she turned to leave, her reflection didn't. It stayed, just for a second too long. And its smile lingered, a little too wide. Maeve had left the bog behind. The standing stones had vanished. The cottage was boarded up. The notebook burned. The glyph broken. But even as her train pulled into Dublin and the misty countryside receded into memory, something else didn't. Not the memories, not the fear, and not the reflection. She hadn't told anyone. Not the police, not her colleagues, not even her sister. About the moment the mirror blinked out of sync. About how, just before she turned away, her reflection had stood just a fraction too long. Long enough to make a new rule in Maeve's life. No more mirrors. Ever. Not in the house. Not in the car. Not even in the corner of her phone camera. Because deep down, she knew, the thing she had banished hadn't gone back into the bog. It had stayed with her, and it was waiting for another crack. The weeks that followed were hollow. Sleep came in fragments. She heard soft footsteps in the kitchen at night, only to find it empty. Her apartment lights flickered in exact patterns. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. The power company blamed it on faulty wiring. Maeve knew better. That was how Ronan had described the glyph's chant rhythm in his journal. She hadn't told anyone that. One night, she returned home from a lecture on ancient Irish symbology. She placed her keys on the counter, turned, and stopped cold. Her hallway mirror, the one she swore she threw out months ago, was back, framed in dark ash wood, spotless, upright, and it reflected her entire apartment, except it didn't show her. It was empty. Maeve approached slowly. Every cell in her body screamed, "Don't." But she had learned something in the bog. Something no one else knew. You can't unlook what looked at you. And it was looking again. She raised her hand to touch the mirror. But before her skin met the glass, the surface rippled, just like the bog had. And then came the voice. Soft. Familiar. Her own. But not quite. I never stopped being you. You just buried me in the wrong timeline. You don't get to forget. Suddenly, flash. Visions slammed into her mind like a tidal wave of memory. 1,000 reflections. Faces pressed to glass, screaming silently. Ronan's open mouth in the bog. Not gasping, but inviting. The glyph burning into her skin. Not physically, but deep, somewhere in her timeline. A girl, age 7, whispering to her own reflection, and the reflection whispering first. That girl was her. Long before the cairns. Before Ronan. Before the name Maeve Lorcan had meaning. The mirror pulsed again. And then a face formed in the glass. Not quite hers. Eyes just a little too wide. Smile a little too steady. Hair floating like it was underwater. It spoke. You can close the breath. But only by closing the self. Maeve didn't move. What do you want from me? The reflection tilted its head. I want what you buried. The moment you stepped back from the cairn. The second you said, it was just a trick of light. I want the doubt. That's the crack I live in. Maeve felt it then. Like her spine was no longer aligned with her reflection. One breath off. One beat out of sync. The glyph hadn't ended anything. It had only paused the loop. And loops always resume. She backed away. Pulled every curtain shut. Took the mirror. Wrapped it in bedsheets. Shoved it into the fireplace. And set it ablaze. This time she didn't hesitate. The fire screamed. Not from the glass, but from the air behind her. And when she turned, no one was there. Just her empty apartment. And the sound of her own heartbeat. Perfectly, finally, in sync. The next morning, she went to the university library and donated all her research. Every note, every journal, every page of Ronan's copied writing. And in a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds this, she wrote just 6 words. Don't chase what remembers you back. Maeve never gave another lecture. Never taught again. She moved to an unnamed coastal village near Donegal. Off the grid. And when neighbors asked about her, about the scar on her palm, about her insistence on covering every reflective surface, she just smiled softly and said, some things are better buried. Epilogue. 6 months later, a young folklore student named Cian visited the Trim Historical Archives to investigate a forgotten sect, the Chronovale Breathers. He opened a sealed box labeled Ronan Fen/M. Lorcan, Field Research. Inside, he found burnt paper, old maps, and a single shattered mirror shard. When he picked it up, he chuckled. Creepy, right? He said to the librarian. She didn't laugh. She was staring at the shard. In it, his reflection wasn't smiling. It was screaming. If you want more chilling true crime stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the Veil of Secrets.